We will start, and as people join, they will get the gist, I'm sure. So welcome to the first FWD Sustainability Forum. We're really excited to launch this series and take on the work that we completed last year with 3Keel sustainability consultants who will be leading us through this series on a journey to a greener, brighter wholesale sector. This afternoon, we're going to be hearing from Harvey Tebay from Denton's Global Advisors. His speciality will be looking at the policy remit around this space and explaining why this matters, why we're on a journey to net zero from a political point of view. So that will just set out the guidance coming down from government and the rules by which we all should be adhering to. So Harvey will take over in a moment, and then following on from Harvey, we will be hearing from Alwyn Smith and Emily from 3Keel. As I said, they are the consultants that brought us the Net Zero Roadmap last year, and this session is to give you a really good introduction to that roadmap. So it's refreshing your memory of how to use it, because it's meant to be a textbook rather than a reference guide. So it's meant to be a tool to help you and your business on that journey to net zero. And the session is in for 60 minutes, but we actually would really like to extend that a little bit and give you a live demo of how to use the carbon calculator tool. It's straightforward, I'm told, in terms of these type of tools, but if you're not an Excel native or you haven't calculated your carbon footprint before, this will be a really good walkthrough. But understand that you've got 60 minutes in your diary, so if you need to drop off, it's a reminder that this session is being recorded and you'll have access to it afterwards. So with all the housekeeping done, and without further ado, I shall introduce Harvey. And then once Harvey is finished, I will just introduce you to 3Keel. Take it away, Harvey.
Thanks, Lindsay. I've also got my colleague here, Josh, as well, who'll be presenting on this today. So I hope you can all see my screen. I'm just going to full screen it now. Lindsay, shout if you can't see it. I'll take that as you can.
Yeah, we've got it.
Great. I'll hand over to my colleague Josh.
Great, thanks, Harvey. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Josh. I'm a director at Denton's Global Advisors, and Harvey and I are going to kind of walk you through, I guess, just to kind of give a bit of political context to our kind of wider climate commitments, going back to 2019 when we first made the decision to kind of sign up to net zero. I'm then going to walk us through, I guess, at a high level, I guess, what progress we've made over the course of the last few years in actually kind of achieving some of our commitments. And then kind of the elephant in the room, you all will have seen that a general election has now been called. So we're going to do a bit of a kind of high level overview as to what some of the kind of main announcements are that Labour are kind of looking at, particularly because polls are obviously showing us that Labour look as though they might be kind of forming the next government after the general election taking place in July. Then finally, I'm going to hand over back to Harvey, who's going to look at some of the kind of main policy areas that impact in the wholesale sector and setting out some of the kind of policies in this space. So we'll kind of kick off there. If Harvey can come to the next slide. So just kind of going back to how this has all come about, really, kind of action in the net zero space. So back in 2019, the UK became the first major economy in the world to commit to reach net zero by 2050. And this is an image on the right-hand side here of Chris Skidmore, who's a former Conservative minister, and he's actually kind of signing legislation into place there. So what does net zero actually mean? What it actually kind of means is the UK is committed to reducing, committed to a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 as compared to a baseline set out in 1990. And there are different approaches that are taking place across the 4 nations in the UK. So England, Wales, and Northern Ireland are all on track to reach net zero by 2050, while Scotland's taking a bit more of an ambitious approach to set their own target to have a net zero economy by 2045. And there is some pretty good news in our kind of journey to net zero. As a country, we've made some really good progress. Emissions have halved between 1990 and 2022. And actually, in the latest kind of third carbon budget, there was a 15%, but actually the UK overachieved by 50% in this latest budget. And that was largely down to the fact that we're starting to transition away from fossil fuels, so fossil fuels like coal, and moving towards more renewable technologies such as offshore wind. So, for example, if you look at somewhere like Scotland, almost 100% of the electricity grid there is actually made up by renewable technologies. So while the government, I guess, has kind of set the agenda and set the direction of travel, businesses are really kind of stepping up and stepping up in their own net zero efforts as well. Around 4,000 companies and financial institutions have signed up to net zero and have set their own pretty punchy kind of net zero targets, which have been validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a UN-backed climate action group, which specialises in helping businesses with their climate action. So that's a high-level overview of how we've got here, and also, I guess, what some of the steps the business has been taking. And I guess kind of moving on to the next slide, in terms of how the government is actually kind of held to account on this. And I guess our kind of progress towards net zero is really kind of home checked. Our home was marked by the Committee on Climate Change, and they're an independent body who each year publish a progress report to Parliament. And the next two slides, this slide and the next slide, are taken from last year's report. And this kind of slide really kind of outlines the changes in emissions that we've seen in key sectors between 2021 and 2022, as we were emerging from COVID. And as you can kind of see on this graph here, areas like electricity supply, where renewables are coming online, emissions have fallen. However, there are other areas such as aviation, industry, and residential buildings where technologies are either not quite there yet, or we've still got a bit of work to do. And then just moving on to the next slide, I guess just to try and kind of highlight the work that still needs to be done, this slide really kind of gives you a bit of a high-level overview picture, really, just to kind of outline where we're on track and where we really still need to make progress. So in certain areas that are kind of highlighted in green, such as energy efficiency, such as electric car sales and food waste, we're making really, really good progress on our journey to net zero. But there's some other areas where we quite clearly need to do a bit more work. So energy efficiency, electric van sales, and industrial processes, quite clearly more work needs to be done. I think that really kind of outlines some of the areas where, it's for business and the next government to ensure that we remain on track to deliver net zero by 2050. And kind of moving on to the next slide, as I kind of said at the start, really, we all know that a general election has been called for the 4th of July. And as if the polls to be believed, Labour are going to be kind of forming a majority government after the next election. And one of the things that I guess Keir Starmer and Labour have really been trying to promote as one of their missions for kind of government, really, is to try and make Britain a clean energy superpower. And if Labour do form the next government, we really, really do think that there's going to be an acceleration in our journey to net zero, building on what's taken place over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. So just kind of working our way through these kind of boxes on the left-hand side here. Net zero really is at the heart of what Keir Starmer wants to do, so much so that last week, Keir Starmer kind of set out his own pledge card, and one of his first steps as part of that would be to kind of set up GB Energy, which will be a publicly owned clean power company to kind of cut bills and boost energy security. And Labour also wants to spend more money on clean energy. So Labour wants to spend £4.67 billion on top of £10 billion that's already been committed into clean energy technologies such as offshore wind, such as solar, floating offshore wind. And the reason why they're doing that is that they really want to accelerate the decarbonisation of power. So they really want to kind of go further and faster on making sure that we have kind of clean electricity. And GB Energy will be a kind of really central vehicle to having sure we kind of meet that target. And the main kind of differentiation between the government and Labour on this at the moment is that the government wants to hit this clean power target of having clean electricity by 2035, whereas Labour wants to bring that forward to 2030. And really, the key to enabling all of this to take place will be reforms to the planning system. So at the moment, we have massive kind of backlogs to try and connect these brand new kind of shiny offshore and onshore wind projects onto the grid, because our planning system just really isn't fit for purpose. And really, we need planning reform to make sure that these projects, which can sometimes take up to 10 years to kind of get online, come online within kind of 2 years, really. So that's something that's really going to be the heart of what Labour wants to do. And the really heartening thing is that while Labour, I guess, are going to be kind of ensuring that clean energy is going to be the heart of their plans for government, actually the public really kind of back action on net zero, and if anything, they really want us to be going further and faster. So we've really seen consistent polling in favour of net zero activity, and actually YouGov polling shows that 50% of the public believe that we're actually not going fast enough. So all in all, if the polls are to be believed, Labour will be forming the next government. They can be going further and faster on net zero. The public are on the side, and really Labour and the public, I guess, want to be working with businesses to ensure that the plans they've got in place, some of which are set out here, are taken forward in the next Parliament. So I'm now going to hand over to Harvey to take us through, I guess, some of the kind of specific policies for wholesale.
Thanks, Josh. So I'm just going to run through kind of a few policies that are on the horizon and what we can really expect to see over the next few years as well. So firstly, we've got the extended producer responsibility. I'm sure many of you on this call are very familiar with that, but this is kind of one of the circular economy policies that the government is looking to introduce. So it's due to be implemented in 2027, and the idea behind EPR is that it is a scheme that for packaging that introduces responsibility for UK businesses who put any primary packaging onto the market. And the ultimate aim is that with any packaging that you're putting onto the market, we want to incentivize to put on more recyclable materials. So for instance, later on in this year, we're expecting the government to release different fees for different packaging products. So the more recyclable have cheaper fees, hence incentivizing businesses to use those. So looking ahead, kind of what we can expect from Labour. So Labour strongly supports EPR, and they're looking to enhance sustainability and reduce the overall environmental impact. However, there are some concerns within industry about how it's going to work. So Labour currently want to make sure it's going to be implemented properly, and they do not want to create any undue burden for businesses. There's a round of engagement going on at the moment, which up until yesterday was kind of progressing quite nicely, but now obviously we're in a 6 weeks period where that probably won't take place, and then come the next election and we'll see who's in government, that will probably pick up again quite quickly, with the aim for this to be properly implemented in 2027. And for those that are working within kind of the EPR realm, just to kind of flag that there is a data reporting deadline at the end of this month. So kind of it's important that you do collect all of your data and report this to the Environment Agency and DEFRA. So that's EPR. Kind of on the same note as EPR as well, we have the deposit risk return scheme. So you may be familiar with this and you may see it across Europe as well, but DRS essentially is a system where consumers pay a small deposit for a beverage container, which is then refunded when that container is returned for recycling. So this sits alongside EPR. So kind of there are a few materials that are in scope of DRS, so that's PET, steel and aluminium. So kind of what you would normally expect kind of drinks containers to look like. So we got some big news a month ago, and they said that DRS is now formally delayed until 2027. So we didn't know when it was going to happen, but now it's kind of been formally pushed back. It means that kind of people can start, and policymakers can start designing what this policy is going to look like, and actually kind of design the different aspects of it. For instance, you have a deposit management organisation, which is there's going to be one in each of the different nations, and that's going to determine kind of what that looks like, because there are some discrepancies between kind of how the different nations are going to work. So you'll see here, Wales want to include glass, but they need to formally request an exemption from the UK government to do that. And it's very likely that the UK government will say no. So this could be a big threat to the kind of the way that DRS is implemented, because it doesn't work for businesses when you have different products in different scopes working within different nations. It just doesn't work. As it says here, there needs to be kind of policies that align. We can't have divergence because this can lead to increased SKU proliferation, inefficiencies and higher costs. And then finally, just from a transport perspective, the government is really ramping up their support at the moment with HGVs. So they recently consulted on whether they were going to include HGVs in the 2035 phase out or instead delay that to 2040. At the moment, they're still making their decision on what that's going to look like, but they are ramping up their support. So late last year, they announced £200 million for the HGV zero emission infrastructure and demonstrator programme, which equipped 370 zero tailpipe emission HGVs and all the infrastructure they require, clearly sending a very strong indicator to kind of businesses in this sector that we are moving in that direction and businesses must start acting now. Kind of alongside this, and this is kind of was a political topic, it's the low emission zones and ULEZ. So you'll remember this was quite important late last year when Boris Johnson resigned, and we thought this was going to be a big political football where everyone was voting along the lines of ULEZ, but that contributes to belief that actually was kind of the myth was busted, as shown in the recent mayoral elections where Sadiq Khan won, and that was kind of the crux of Susan Hall's campaign was ULEZ. So ultimately it shows that the public is kind of on the side of ULEZ and low emission zones. So those are going to be coming in further and faster. Labour have also committed to helping businesses in all sectors of the economy to accelerate to net zero. So kind of ultimately the message here along with these policies is that things are progressing quite quickly. We can expect with the Labour government that they're going to progress them at the same rate, if not faster, but they are looking to support businesses on all of this kind of transition to net zero as well. So that was a whistle-stop tour of all of the policy areas. I'll stop now in case anyone has any questions.
No, I think the best way probably to ask questions throughout this, and I should have said, is to put something in the chat. So if you've got a question, pop it in the chat and I'll be keeping an eye on that. But thank you very much, Josh and Harvey. I'm so sorry, Josh, that I didn't introduce you at the beginning. Very sorry about that. Fantastic run through. Thank you. We're now going to hand over to Emily and Olwen, who are going to take us through all things green.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hello everyone. Really nice to be here. We're delighted to be running the Sustainability Forum sessions with FWD over the next year or so, and really excited to have kicked it off today. Quick introduction then, I'm Olwen Smith, I'm a Principal Consultant at 3Keel and joined by my colleague Emily, who's a consultant at 3Keel, and she'll be stepping in to deliver the second half of this presentation. So I'll first just run you through the agenda we have planned for today. We'll begin with a quick introduction, explaining the aims of today's session and very briefly introducing 3Keel as an organisation. Then we'll dive into why climate action matters. We'll then turn to the FWD Net Zero Roadmap that was published last year. Hopefully many of you will be familiar with it already. And then really getting into the meat of the session today, which is trying to provide some practical steps to businesses to help kickstart your climate journey. And Emily then will be giving you a quick introduction to carbon footprinting, which, as Lindsay said, will include a live demo of a hotspot emissions calculator tool, which we developed in collaboration with FWD last year. So if you move on to the session aims, thank you. So as said, we're going to introduce 3Keel and also the work we've done with FWD over the last 18 months or so. We'll build an understanding of the climate crisis, but also particularly honing in on how that could affect the wholesale sector and the risks that you may be facing as businesses. And then providing that practical guidance, as I said, we really want to make sure there's some tangible actions that can be taken out of this session. As said, this is going to be a series of forums, likely to be run on a quarterly basis. And intentionally, this first forum is quite general in our topic and you know, getting started, it being the theme running through it. But we'll then have follow-on sessions that deep dive in bit more focused way into specific topic areas. So do watch out for the next one, likely coming in August. So briefly about 3Keel, we are a specialist sustainability consultancy. We are UK based, been around for about 10 years, and we focus primarily on the food and drink and associated sectors. We've a lot of experience working with actors right across the food supply chain. So retailers, hospitality, food manufacturers, now increasingly wholesalers, and then right down to kind of farm level and food producers as well. And our areas of expertise are quite broad. So myself and Emily sit in the climate change team, but we have colleagues who span across these other areas like resilient agricultural, commodities, and a topic like nature and biodiversity, which is really growing in importance for many companies lately. So moving on then to why climate action matters, and I think it was really nice to get that tee up from Josh and Harvey on this kind of political landscape, but zooming back even further as to what climate change is, and aware there's a lot of terminology that's floated around that can often be confusing. So we first wanted to just explain the concept of climate change really, and the fact that greenhouse gases, or you sometimes will hear them referred to as GHGs, are the primary cause of climate change. So you'll see the two graphics on the left-hand side of the screen here are just a quite simplistic way of showing when more greenhouse gases are produced, and that might be through industrial emissions, it could also be through methane from farming, and nitrous oxide from fertilizer on farms. When there's a buildup of the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere above the kind of natural greenhouse levels, that means that more heat is trapped within the Earth's atmosphere, less heat then can escape because that layer of gases keeps it nearer to the Earth's surface, and then you get these increasing global temperatures, as the graph on the right here shows you. Over the past 60 or so years, it's been a really, really steady increase, and unfortunately the last few years have just continued to break records. What that means then is you get more extreme weather events, and on the next slide we'll show you some of the kind of climate risks that oh sorry, apologies, I've jumped ahead. Let me first talk about the concept of net zero. So net zero was mentioned in the first section of the presentation by Josh, and I think it's again a term that can have a bit of ambiguity around it. I find this visual quite helpful because it shows you on the left-hand side the state that we're in at the moment, which is where there's a really, really high volume of GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, and a very small amount of emissions being removed naturally through trees or soil or other natural parts of the world. To get to net zero, what we need to happen is for those GHG emissions represented in the navy bar to really, really rapidly and steeply decrease, so that they equal the amount of removals. So we'll also see a small increase in the amount of removals, but the primary change between now and a place of net zero is reducing our emissions. So decarbonising our industrial processes and making sure that farming is done in a lower carbon way. The next slide now is the one I was previously referring to, which is just, linking back to the climate change meaning and the greenhouse gases, but what does that result in then in terms of what we're seeing day to day? And it's really primarily more extreme weather events that we're seeing, floods, storms, etc. But also there's more chronic weather changes, which particularly for the food sector are very important because it means the yields are changing. We've seen one of the wettest winters on record here in the UK just gone. They're predicting really steep decreases in the yields for many crops on the back of that. And then there's also, other parts of the world where we're very reliant on sourcing food, and there's drought there. That means again, crops are becoming less resilient. So that's the risks that we usually deem climate or physical climate risks. But on the right side of the slide, there's also something called transition risks, and these are kind of second effect risks that as the economy adjusts to become more low carbon and meet net zero, there can be changes and transitions that affect your business. So that could be the market changes and consumers have different preferences. It can be technology developments, regulation. We've just heard some very concrete examples, and I'll touch on a few more. The reputation, so increasingly consumers are wanting to understand are the businesses they source from sustainable. The next slide then is just zooming in on this risk factor, particularly for the food and beverage sector. I won't dwell on it too long, but this slide is an output from a UK climate change risk assessment that took place a couple of years ago, and it really identified that the food sector is at particular risk from a number of these extreme and chronic weather changes that climate change is precipitating. One other one to call out here being in agriculture, there's changes of temperature mean that there can be different pests, and that can affect crops as well. And so, not to dwell too much on the risk side of things, I'll also just move along now to the regulatory landscape at a kind of more high level than what's just being discussed. I think it's great to see those really concrete, specific UK policies and how they'd affect wholesalers. But what this slide is demonstrating is there's going to be a lot more coming from government over the next 5 to 10 years. And so taking climate action now can make sure that you're ahead of the curve on those. So be they more need for regular disclosures on your environmental metrics, examining your supply chain more. There's a lot coming around deforestation in the supply chain and having due diligence there. Then also on eco-labeling and showing to consumers the environmental impact of any given product. And so any regulation related to those areas is going to require companies to have better data management in terms of environmental data in-house and calculating their impact, and being able to report, as I said, understanding your risks like those I've just gone through, and then that supply chain engagement. And I think you'll see in a couple of slides time for the wholesalers, upstream supply chain is really where the vast majority of your impact lies. So the last slide in this section then, just looking at the broader kind of corporate landscape and reactions to the climate crisis and pressures from stakeholders, from government. We have seen, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative was already mentioned in an earlier slide, there's been a big uptake in companies that are starting to set targets and declare their ambitions to reduce their emissions. So globally, then there's over 8,000 companies which have declared they will set targets or have had targets validated through this Science-Based Targets Initiative. I've called out a few on the slide here, just a number of the many hundreds from the UK that feature and are kind of at least adjacent to the wholesale sector. Great. Okay, so then we're turning to the FWD roadmap. As said, hopefully some of you on the call already are aware of this roadmap, may have even delved into it when it was launched last summer in June. But a little bit of context, so Treacle works very closely with FWD and also the Scottish Wholesale Association over a 6+ month project to develop this roadmap. It involved engagement with members to both gather data and get other input. And then really the aim of the roadmap was to firstly identify the hotspots of emissions for the sector, and secondly to set the ambition of decarbonising the sector and give a specific date for that. So the date of 2040 was chosen. And ultimately it was about driving action. So we tried to design the roadmap in a really practical way where there's a lot of concrete decarbonisation actions outlined that companies can take. And finally, one piece to mention here is we did link it back to policy. So aware that FWD particularly has a very strong voice in engaging with policymakers. At each stage of the roadmap, we called out what would be the policy enablers that would help to decarbonise in a more rapid way. Just a quick point to that sector-wide view then, when considering the year that FWD should choose for the net zero target, we looked across many of the other related sectors and any kind of commitments they had already made. And we've seen that Treacle has actually already worked quite closely with the British Retail Consortium, with the Food and Drink Federation, and they had released roadmaps that were all in line with the 2040 net zero target. And that matters because it's all one system and one value chain ultimately, even if there's different sections of it working more or less independently. And so the idea that FWD puts the commitment in the same year as these other organizations is quite powerful because it leads to this kind of more sector-wide transformation ultimately. So now getting into some of the details on the wholesale sector's emissions profile. I think this is a really fascinating slide and we've had really good reaction from those who've seen it to date. This essentially shows the emissions of the UK wholesale sector as a whole, and they're divided across the different value chain stages. So on the left you can see that's the upstream, also known as scope 3 emissions. In the middle, that's the direct or operational kind of manufacturing, or well, sorry, just operational emissions in this case. And then downstream, what happens after wholesalers sell products. And interestingly, the bulk of the emissions for wholesalers is lying actually in the upstream and downstream portions in what we call scope 3. The size of the yellow bubbles here indicate the relative amount of emissions for that category. So you'll see immediately that ingredient production is where the vast majority of your emissions are lying as a sector. And then if you focus in on scope 1 and 2, so your operational emissions, and we look at the donut chart that's coming out of that, the bulk of those emissions are stemming from vehicle fuel use. So that's where the transport and logistics part is really, really crucial. The next slide then is just showing you within the roadmap the different decarbonisation themes is how we describe them, but basically the different areas of action that need to be focused on to ensure that the sector decarbonises. We particularly focused the effort on this roadmap on those scope 1 and 2 emissions, because although they only constitute a small amount of your total emissions, there is much more direct control that wholesalers have over them. So that was where we prioritise the focus of the report. And you can see the graph here coded by category shows the split of the emissions across vehicles, electricity, refrigeration, and heat. And And the next slide then shows you that for each of these 5 themes, we had various sections. So we introduced the theme. Then, as I said, we discussed the policy enablers, so that's very crucial. We went into very concrete business actions and even provided some quite practical resources for other initiatives that are focused on, in this case, vehicles and logistics decarbonisation. And then we called out a practical example of wholesalers already taking action in this space. So here we have Cisco and their zero or their electric HGV initiative. So that's all from my side. At this point, I'm really glad to hand over to Emily, who's going to take you through the next part.
Great, thanks, Olwen. Yeah, so for the next category, the next series of slides, we have some practical steps to kickstart your climate journey, and sort of leading on from that overview of the roadmap, another chapter within it is a getting started guide. And so this is sort of related to and building on what's covered in that section of the roadmap. So the getting started guide provides some simple practical guidance for wholesalers, particularly those who are earlier in the climate action journey. We split it into these 4 pillars of action, which is based on the UK Transition Plan Task Force implementation guidance. So that kind of steps out a basic process into kind of getting a good baseline, which is essentially your first carbon footprint, setting an ambition, target development, and then moving on to more kind of implementation and delivery. So the next few slides kind of build on that. So although we've outlined these 4 steps within the getting started guide, it might not actually be entirely linear. So it kind of depends slightly on whether you've taken some steps already, or maybe some areas of the business might be further advanced than others, already implementing carbon reduction actions, and that kind of closely mirrors the development of policy in some areas rather than others as well. So this section goes into some wider business actions on how to deliver the content covered in the 4 pillars covered in the getting started guide. Even just calculating your carbon footprint, it does require an element of sort of groundwork to be in a position to do that calculation, to collect the data and to understand your emission sources. So these kind of groundwork actions are what we'll walk you through. So the first step we'd recommend is to set up a climate action working group. The purpose of this initially is to establish a team that is dedicated to progressing with the business's climate agenda. Once that's a little bit more established, it also then just provides a forum to share learnings, track the progress against, and also support with barriers. So that's really like your core climate team within the business. In order to set this up, we'd recommend a kind of 4-step process. The first is to identify team members. You'd want some team members that represent all different aspects of the business operations. As Olwen showed us the diagram of the wholesale emissions, they occur throughout the operations, throughout the supply chain. So you'd want to reflect that within the team. And in setting that up, you can either assign responsibility kind of from top down, or look at more a voluntary basis if there are those in the business that have a more personal interest in it, or maybe a combination of both, depending on turning on your setup. Once you've got your team itself, you'd move on to establishing some objectives. We'd recommend having kind of a mixture of high-level objectives that may be a bit more strategic, that the entire group can get behind, and can be reflected in high-level kind of business planning as well, but then also some more specific objectives that are tailored to more granular sources of emissions and that can be allocated to specific task members. And that's closely linked to the 3rd step, which is assigning responsibility for those tasks. You'd want a series of tasks to set out a plan of how to achieve each objective, and then either an individual role or a team might be assigned each task that's kind of relevant to their business function and the emissions associated with it. So that's kind of how to step through and get a good baseline, get yourself set up. And then once you've got into that stage where everyone's feel comfortable and established, looking forward to organising meetings, agreeing on a regularity of meetings and ensure that's formalized in calendars, and setting some deadlines against the objectives to align with these, so that you can keep an eye on your progress and kind of hold each other accountable a little bit as well. So once you've set up your climate action working group, this will really help to create kind of shared responsibility for carbon reduction. It's really important because the task of reducing your carbon emissions definitely doesn't just sit solely within one role or one team. It's going to be much more effective if it's really built into multiple different roles and championed across the business, because they occur so widely across the business. So in this slide, we've basically outlined some of those roles and their kind of corresponding emissions sources aligned with the themes that we listed within the roadmap. So we've got 5 themes and just provided some examples of the types of job titles which might be associated with each, which you'd either want to have in your working group or have some responsibility against within their job role, that sort of thing. So some of the job titles here might appear multiple times. For instance, say site supervisor, operational manager, could have oversight of electricity, heating, general building management and maintenance, whereas others are going to be slightly more specific, looking at, fleet manager is only really going to be interested in zero emissions vehicles. So it will be a bigger, carbon reduction will be a bigger focus in some areas than others, but it should be reflected to some degree in all different business functions. I think it's also worth drawing out this kind of other category here, which might not be so directly tied to emission sources, but is really going to be critical to the delivery of a lot of the emissions reductions, particularly looking at financial managers or finance directors, because as with anything, there will be financial and cost implications to changing the business model, changing business operations, and getting them on board and involved is really critical to ensuring a kind of consistent and high quality delivery. And that all contributes to this idea of embedding action within the business, which throughout the past couple of slides, I've kind of been talking about indirectly. But the overall goal is to create a bit of a climate action ecosystem, which is demonstrated by the visualization on the slide. Realize you won't be able to read the specific wording, but the intention is to kind of demonstrate the range of actions that are required to begin this process of embedding carbon and keeping climate actions front of mind, both day to day and for a higher level strategy. So each of these coloured slices actually represents a different area of the business, a different area of climate action required to reach net zero. So just to draw out a few, this orange slice here outlines some of the actions required to deliver emissions reduction specifically, whether that's data collection, creating aligned IT systems so it's easy to pull the data that you might need to track progress, supply chain management, research and development, adapting existing product mixes, that sort of thing. Then another really key one for kind of any business in the food and drink sector, and wholesale is no exception, is this purple one here, which is stakeholder engagement. Collaboration is really critical, as we saw so many of the emissions occur up the value chain and down the value chain, and your scope 3 will be someone else's scope 1. So there definitely are opportunities to collaborate and share learnings and kind of align on your goals there. So this kind of represents the breadth of actions that's required and how there is definitely a role to play across so many different business functions. To achieve this, I know it's a lot to take in, but so we've kind of split out some additional actions to achieve this based on some basic steps and more advanced. So basic if you're very new to all of this and still kind of grasping what that looks like within your business, and then advanced steps where you've begun the process but just want to take it that one step further. So basic steps would look like identifying those team members, setting up the climate action working group as we mentioned, but also ensuring that there's resources allocated to the roles so they can deliver them. You've got buy-in from senior management, you're planning on upskilling and building knowledge within the team so that people feel confident to take these actions forward. And then from a more advanced perspective, it would be looking beyond your own operations to wider stakeholders, which identifying customers and suppliers you can align with, also looking at a further long-term view rather than just short-term planning, building in climate action as a strategic priority for future investment, and really drilling down on that kind of business transformation piece. And that ties very closely with investing in training to build up those skills and knowledge. I think this process of embedding climate action within the business is definitely going to require lots of learning, definitely capacity building to kind of build up that knowledge and the skills base required, because the idea is that each role or individual takes ownership of their targets and feels kind of empowered to deliver them. So the idea is kind of build confidence and empowerment to talk about this relatively new emerging ecosystem and build up that carbon literacy. So for the basic level, you would start by just kind of reviewing the skills, understanding where people are at, if there is any existing capacity within the business, or if there are any really critical gaps. For instance, if sustainability is not kind of anybody's dedicated role, whether that's singularly as a sustainability manager or partially. Sometimes we work with clients where they share comms and sustainability or operations and sustainability. So some kind of dedicated resource is really key to kind of drive it forward and to champion it within the business. Determining the goals and also encouraging staff, particularly those who might be interested in joining the climate action working group, to seek training that's specific to their role and build up their own knowledge at the individual. And finally, attending events and webinars such as this one. This is already a good tick in that box, but yeah, as much as that is great, just to kind of round off that knowledge and provide a good foundation. And then once you feel as though that's a comfortable level within the business, looking to deliver kind of more targeted workshops, which falls into the advanced category that we've put here, so focusing on kind of specific areas that your business has a high prevalence within. Lindsay, I've just noticed your hand. I hope you haven't been waiting there too long.
No, I haven't at all. I've just noticed a question. So as it was regarding a bit of this section and we've got a long session ahead, I thought we'd ask it as we go, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, of course, go for it.
Okay, does a net zero roadmap have to be aligned to the SBTI targets, or can it be house targets?
So it doesn't have to be. There's no requirement. Targets, as they are at the moment, climate targets, as far as I'm aware, are all voluntary. We'd always recommend that they be science aligned, at least, if not actually set with the Science Based Targets Initiative, because that science aligned essentially means that the calculations have been done in the background to ensure that your target is ambitious enough that it keeps within that warming threshold of 1.5 degrees, which is kind of the limit that we're hoping to kind of keep within at the moment. There are lots of good resources, even if Science Based Targets Initiative is kind of not within obtainable reach at the moment, or is not kind of on the short-term plan. They do have a lot of good resources, so you can sort of piggyback their hard work to ensure that you've got a science-aligned target as well. The only caveat I would say to that is we are kind of seeing an emergence of a requirement of targets from customers or suppliers who are asking their suppliers to have targets, and if they might dictate, oh, we would like this supplier to have a science-based targets because it's verified by a third party. So that's the only kind of watch out if you're setting in-house targets. Was there another question, or did I?
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question on training and training providers, but I'm going to follow up with you later on that and get back to that individual.
All right, brilliant. Okay, it's good timing actually, because our next question is all about, our next slide is all about developing a target. So all the actions outlined on our previous slides that we've gone through have kind of culminate in this process of setting a target. So as you're all aware, FWD has set a net zero target for 2040. So this process of developing a target may be to align with that. It might be to set short-term targets, or kind of just plan on the delivery of the target. So the actual target in question here can be a variety of things, but they generally follow this similar process. So you would start with collecting data, and we kind of recommend looking at the greenhouse gas protocol. The guidance produced by the greenhouse gas protocol is a bit of a Bible in the carbon accounting world. And so that will help you identify all the different sources of emissions of activity data, which is kind of the base data you would need from an operational perspective. So that might be litres of fuel consumed or kilowatt hours of electricity, tons of product purchase, that sort of thing, across a 12-month period. So once which can be a bit of a process in itself, actually, just collecting all of those different data sources, because they span from every different corner of the business. So once you've collected all of them across a 12-month reporting period, you can then look to calculating the carbon footprint itself, which we'll go through a little bit later. We've also got the tool demo, which is, the tool itself is a hotspot tool, but it will provide you with a really good, hopefully like a good starter and understanding of the sorts of data that you might need to calculate your carbon footprint, and then how that's reflected in emissions and tons of carbon. So hopefully that would be a good foundation. But you would want to calculate your carbon footprint, ensuring that all of your operations and supply chain are included. Then thirdly, you'd want to look at the target development, and we definitely recommend using some of the resources already available out there. There's lots of really great tools from the Science Based Targets Initiative, which I've just put on the slide as SBTI for short, and also the SME Climate Hub for smaller businesses is really helpful and a really great resource to use. And that will help sort of guide the level of your target and provide a bit more information on what's a realistic time frame, what's a realistic reduction perspective, potential from those who are kind of experts in the climate science. So that's a really good place to start for that. And then once you've developed the target and you've looked at, you've got signed it off within the business, you'd want to set them and track progress. So that's kind of quantifying how to meet them, planning on the delivery, timescales, feasibility, looking at specific carbon reduction actions, and understanding how implementing all of them together might culminate in your delivery of the target. So these targets will be achieved through a number of different actions, as I've said, across all of aspects of the business. On this slide, we've listed some of the sort of quick wins or low-hanging fruit, which can be implemented within the short term. Again, we've got 4 of the 5 pillars from the roadmap represented here, and following that structure of basic and advanced. For instance, if we just looked at renewable electricity, a kind of basic approach would be looking at purchasing renewable electricity certificates, identifying a plan to increase efficiency, reduce consumption, that sort of thing. And then more advanced, you'd be looking at on-site renewables or a purchase power agreement, which is contract between electricity generator and a kind of utility or government or company. So yeah, PPAs can last anywhere between sort of 5 and 20 years. So those two are sort of the more mature offering, I would say. It is worth noting that I won't go through lots of these in detail because, as Olwen mentioned, we'll have subsequent sessions in the future, deep diving into all of these different aspects and looking at the kind of what drives them, what we can do to reduce them, and policy, all of that sort of thing. So this is just a sort of cheat sheet for the short term. So that's the end of that section. I will pause if we've got any questions, because we do have time. If not, I can.
There's a question, Emily, from Mark Earl. Says, given the biggest emission elements in our industry are from external sources, i.e. brand owners and customers, that's the graphic that Olwen showed earlier, the scope 3 stuff rather than scope 1 and 2. Is there a thought process across the FWD whether this type of GHG information could be collated centrally, GHG per box of product from brand owners? And is that something that would be possible, do you think, in your view?
Yeah, it's a good question. Oh, and I didn't know if you were about to unmute.
I'm happy to speak to it, and then do feel free to add,
Sure.
Emily. But yeah, it's a really topical question because, I mean, most companies that are procuring products are kind of grappling with this at the moment, retailers particularly. And there's a kind of growing appreciation that having emissions data at a product level is the most beneficial, because let's say you received information about one of your suppliers' footprints, but at their entire company level, that would be very hard for you to then allocate the emissions just from the specific product or products you're sourcing from them to your own footprint. And so there are quite a lot of different efforts ongoing within the sector, some of them based on kind of new software solutions where companies and food manufacturers primarily, the idea being that they will kind of plug in their product information in terms of the ingredients, etc., and the software can spit out what that would mean in emissions. They're still under development, let's say. I wouldn't say there's a solution that's fully nailed this, because it's a very thorny issue. But I think, yes, there is definitely efforts to centralize this and ensure there isn't the duplication of effort in terms of gathering the data and centralizing it and standardizing it. There's also efforts at a government level. There's a Food Data Transparency Partnership work on this, trying to ensure that there is better availability of food data, as the name would indicate. So I think it's a yes, there's work ongoing, but unfortunately no easy silver bullet solution as it stands.
Yeah, I agree. I think the one that comes to mind is Manufacturer 2030, which is probably the biggest one that I'm aware of a few of our other clients are using.
Also, Mondra is doing quite a lot of work on this as well from a software perspective.
Yeah. So not quite there yet, but hopefully in the future. Great. Okay. So sorry, I can't see the chat. So if there are any questions, please either Lindsay or James or Alwyn just interrupt me. So now I've run through some of the more kind of business focused actions. We've got a couple of slides explaining.
Sorry, Emily, just I am interrupting you. Sorry.
No, go.
Just a follow up from Mark there. He says, great. So this is a watching brief on scope 3 for us till more information is provided. Is that essentially the takeout here?
Yeah, I think at the moment we've definitely focused on scope 1 and 2 because, as Alwyn said, it's kind of more in your direct control. That definitely doesn't mean that scope 3 should be discounted. It's kind of a more prioritization exercise, I suppose, that we've gone through so far. I would definitely imagine in subsequent sessions we'll be covering some aspects of scope 3, particularly kind of procurement and ingredients, because that is, you know, the overwhelming majority of emissions. So it's not covered exceptionally within this one session, but it's definitely not one to forget about, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, given that these are taking place only quarterly, I really encourage you to explore some of the initiatives that are out there. The roadmap has a value chain section within it that I would point you towards, and to kind of check out some of the links and initiatives in there. And no doubt then, as Emily says, we will have more of a dedicated session on it upcoming.
Great. All right, so the next section I would say is probably the most technical. So yeah, please do jump in if there are any questions or I'm, you know, going too quickly or whatever. We just wanted to provide a foundation for understanding your organization's impact, and kind of the idea of setting carbon footprint is you can then identify where to focus your reductions, and that is the input into your target. So just wanted to introduce the process of of calculating carbon footprint, because then hopefully it will add to the understanding of the roadmap demo as well. I have a slide on kind of how emissions occur through the value chain. This slide is food and drink sector specific, but I would say agnostic to the actor within the food and drink sector that you are. So it just kind of encompasses of the entire food and drink supply chain. These are all the different areas that emissions occur. A lot of these will be familiar to the labels that were in the diagram from the wholesale sector. You're looking at everything from the production of raw materials, any transport and processing, emissions from distribution or preparation, consumption and disposal. So really what we call like kind of cradle to grave, the entire supply chain would be encompassed within your carbon footprint. And I think we did mention this earlier, emissions are grouped into scopes, but I will just go into a little bit more detail now on what these scopes are. So the scopes were defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and they're also, the grouping is mainly to do with kind of influence and control, whether that's operational or financial. So your scope 1 emissions are what we call your direct emissions. So these are all the activities that an organization has under their direct control. So any sites that you own, any vehicles that you own, any offices that you own will all fall into scope 1. So you're typically looking at gas, vehicle fuel, any oil, refrigerants, that sort of thing will come under scope 1 as long as it's under your direct control. Anything that you kind of vehicles that you lease, for instance, will come under scope 3. Scope 2 just solely relates to purchased electricity, and then scope 3 is everything else. So from a carbon accounting perspective, we have 15 subcategories of scope 3, and they also include kind of non-product related functions, so the purchase of capital goods, employee movement, so commuting and travel, and then also the downstream, so emissions from retail, end of life emissions, and kind of business functions like investments and franchises and leased assets are also included there as well. And then in terms of the actual equation itself, this is how a carbon footprint is calculated. You need two halves of the equation. The first half you need is activity data, which is when I say collect data in the business, that's kind of what I'm referring to. So that's a business activity and procurement data, which may be kilowatt hours, tons of raw materials, spent on services. Depending on the source of emissions, that kind of dictates roughly what unit you'd be looking for. And then you'd multiply that by an emissions factor. An emissions factor is a number that converts your activity data into a carbon equivalent, or CO2e, and the E just represents all the other greenhouse gases. So there's actually multiple greenhouse gases that are being calculated when you're doing a carbon footprint. but we kind of normalize it under this title of carbon just to make life a little bit easier. So the actual unit that you're reporting is CO2e. I think there's something like 11-ish greenhouse gases that are encompassed within it, but all of that is calculated within the emissions factor. So you don't really need to worry about the number of gases or have you covered off all the gases or anything like that. As long as you're using a CO2e emissions factor, that's just the one number that you need to calculate the carbon footprint. And you just multiply your unit of activity data by your emissions factor, and that gives you the carbon footprint for that operation. So the tool itself, the purpose of the tool is to enable wholesalers to understand how carbon emissions are calculated initially, and also to build understanding of which areas of operation are emitting the greatest volume. We call it a hotspot tool because it identifies kind of the ultimate output is your top 3 greatest sources of emissions, but it also provides a bit more information on top of that. And the additional information includes guidance on how to mitigate them. Practically, it's hosted in Excel. You can download it via the web download on the FWD website, and it does require some input data from your company's operations. So that's just a bit of a caveat. Before you use the tool, you need to have some data to hand, but we'll go through what that data actually looks like now. So I will just have to do a bit of logistics, stopping sharing and sharing and resharing. So just bear with me a second.
Thank you, Emily. And just a reminder to everyone, this was in your diaries for an hour. If you'd like to stay on longer and watch the live demo, that would be fantastic. But it is being recorded for you to take away. And if you haven't tackled a carbon calculator before, even if you watch the live demo, you may well want to refer to this video moving forward too. So as I say, I'll make sure that that is forwarded to all of you. Thanks, Emily.
Hopefully this is big enough. Hopefully you can also see it. I know it's sometimes a bit tricky to see the text when you share things in Excel, so please shout if I need to zoom in anymore. So the idea of this is we'll kind of walk you through how to fill out the tool and what the outputs look like. So we've got some kind of dummy numbers that we can put in to show you what it looks like live as we go through. Just to kick off, I'll just kind of go through an outline of the basic structure of the tool. So it starts off with this user guide, which I won't go through in detail because I'll sort of verbally give you all the information that's in here, but just provides a quick overview of what it is, how to use it, and what the outputs are. The only aspect of this tab that I will draw upon is this area here of required and optional. So as I said, it does require some of your own data. Anything that's a kind of light orange cell, you will need to fill out in order for it to be reflected within the summary. But anything in blue is a sort of nice to have. So if it's there, great, you'll get a little bit extra, kind of more granular calculation. But if not, we can still produce an output with it. So looking first at the inputs tab, this is the only tab that you'll kind of require data for. There's actually there's 5 categories to input data, and they kind of reflect the 5 pillars as well that we've seen already in the roadmap. So hopefully they should be kind of familiar a little bit to you now we've gone through it. We've got these cells in orange where you input data, and then for each of the categories we've got in column N an input quality measurement. So as you can see here, there it's all red because nothing's been filled in. But then if we put in our 3-kilo wholesale, it kind of starts to fill up the bar. So now half of the data has been input, and then if we put our annual revenue, that's a little bit high. There we go. Now you can see it's gone to green. So the idea is that you want it to kind of all be orange and green as you work down. You can also see the reflection of the orange and blue colors as we move down. All of the oranges are the like basic level. So they're the kind of key requirement or the minimum requirement in order to do a calculation. And the advanced is for those who might have already done some emissions calculations or have access to more granular data. Then you can put data in the blue boxes as well. So if we go down to logistics, I'm just flipping between 2. So for logistics, we've got 3 key inputs. We've got HGVs, LGVs, and company cars. So we've got 3 different sources of emissions, 3 vehicle types that emit carbon. But first of all, we've got to look at the reporting period. So this is a temporal scale of how frequently you have data. The most coarse is annually and the most granular is monthly. So for this, the 3 key wholesale, we'll just have annual data. And then again, with each of these data sources, you have a little bit of a choice of the unit of input. So it, again, depends on what data is most easily or readily available to you. You can either input in miles, kilometers, or pounds. So for HGVs, we'll do miles. We'll say 50,000 miles. And then that's just reflected in the progress bar here to the right. And then for LGVs, we'll say, oh, we don't have the actual data, but we do know that we spent £2,500 fuel. And then for company cars, we do have data, but it's in kilometers. So you could mix and match. You don't have to use the same for everything. It's entirely dependent on what data you have available. You just need to have a value and a unit in each of those. As you can see here, the input quality has gone to kind of a yellow or orange, and that's just to reflect that all the key inputs have been filled in, but it's not green because we haven't filled in the advanced input for this categories. But if we say for buildings electricity, perhaps we do have more detailed data. So again, you don't have to be consistent throughout. The only thing that needs to stay consistent is the reporting period. So we need an annual reporting period. So let's say we have 30,000 kilowatt hours of gas, 50 kilowatt hours of oil, and 100,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. Oh, that's wrong. There we go. And 50% electricity tariff. And here it's gone to green. So we've got a basic level of input data for logistics, but we've got an advanced level of input data for buildings electricity. And the kind of input fields are the same. So depending on whether you put in the key input or the advanced input, so you've still got gas reflected in both, you've still got oil reflected in both, electricity, and the only difference is with these two is for the key input, it's just do you have renewable, yes or no, whereas for the advanced, you can put in the actual percentage. So moving on to our fourth one, we've got refrigerants. So for refrigerants, for the key input, we're just looking at the total area of chilled or frozen floor area, or none if you don't have any chilled. So for here, we'd put 50. And again, you have a choice of meters or feet. So let's just say feet. It's probably also worth mentioning that if you have both, so let's say you filled that in and then you find you have refrigerant data, the model will look to the advanced input if it's there. So even though, let's just pick a random, even if you fill out both accidentally or intentionally, it will look at the advanced input. So let's say we have two different types of refrigerant and we've used 5 and 10 kilos of each. It will say you filled in the advanced inputs, and when that feeds into the model calculations, it will be looking at the advanced field. Then finally, we have the value chain. And as we mentioned, the value chain is A, a big source of emissions, but B, a lot more complicated to calculate. So as this is a hotspot model rather than a kind of entire corporate carbon footprint model, we've taken a slightly more high level approach to the value chain. So there's a few areas of the value chain that are slightly easier to calculate. So those are the ones that we have included. And they tend to be emissions associated with kind of employee movements, because a lot of that can be calculated off just the number of employees and taking an estimate of commuting. So if we say for our business, we have 15 employees and we spent £1,000 on business travel. So obviously, employee movements is not the whole of the value chain. The rest of the value chain is calculated based on units of revenue as an estimation kind of in the background of the model. So value chain is included within this, but it's not built off any primary data, apart from the size of the business. So actually, let me just pause there. Any questions? You might just have to shout.
No, there aren't any questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, brilliant. So there are all the inputs. So that's the kind of depth and range of data that we'd be looking for in order to fill out this tool. And then in terms of what that does, what we do with that data. So we have this initially a brief summary and also a detailed summary. So starting off with the brief summary, the first chart shows us the total emissions based off all of the data in the inputs tab. As you can see, the profile for 3 kilo wholesale, the large majority is in the value chain, followed by logistics, buildings, electricity, and then finally refrigerants represent a very small portion. So the value chain is the equivalent of scope 3, and the other 3 are the equivalent of scope 1 and 2s. So this was a sort of split that we would anticipate from any business working in the food and drink sector. The unit here is the tons of CO2e, which we've explained, kind of carbon dioxide equivalent, and you can have that in kilos or tons. The typical unit of measurement we tend to discuss at this scale is tons, so that's what the T stands for. Secondly, we've got this comparison chart. This provides a comparison between our 3 kilo wholesale and the industry average. The average in this chart, or the sector average, sorry, the sector average was calculated using primary data that we collected last year, spring in 2023, as part of the process to estimate the emissions associated with the entirety of the wholesale sector. It's also the same data that fed into the graphic with the yellow bubbles that we looked at earlier. So it's pulling from the same data set. But rather than looking at the kind of total emissions profile that we have on the left here, this is an intensity metric, which just enables a kind of more standardized comparison. So what we mean when we say intensity is it's the tons of emissions per pound of revenue. So it kind of normalizes for the size of the business and just looks at how emissions intensive they are or not. So as you can see in this example, 3 kilo wholesale is more emissions intensive than the sector average. However, the proportion of sources is roughly comparable.
Emily, just before you go on, one question has come in chat for it says for the logistics section of the calculator, what do you enter for electric vehicles? As obviously electricity might be purchased offsite.
That's a very good question. And actually, probably something that's not currently reflected that well within the models. So I wouldn't recommend putting it in as pounds, even if it's pounds of electricity, because that pound is related to a kind of more traditional fuel metric. So I would say don't put it in as that. If it's not reflected within kind of your general electricity purchasing, I would say potentially build it in there if you can. For instance, if you know the kilowatt hour consumption, maybe perhaps add it to your total electricity consumption. But other than that, I might have to get back to you, because it's not something that is explicitly drawn out within the logistics section at the moment.
Okay, Emily, I will take a note of Scott's details and get you in touch.
Yes, yeah. Great, okay, any other questions before I move on to the detailed summary? No, okay, great. So this is, yeah, a more drilled down version of the brief summary. This tab contains a breakdown of the largest emission sources for the company. And so this is where the kind of hotspot aspect comes in. And what the model does is it will read your 3 largest emission sources, and it will spit out kind of these 3 donut charts. So for our example, the value chain is the first hotspot, representing about 93% of total emissions. Logistics are the second, with about 5%, and building electricity represent 2%. So what this does
Can you
is
make that? Sorry, Emily, to interrupt. Are you able to make that just a little bit bigger? It might be my old eyes, but
no,
yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
I can even go one more. There we go. Yeah, that's nice and cool, hopefully. Yes, so not only do you draw out the top 3 hotspots and roughly what percentage they're representative, but also it like drills down within each donut chart the main contributors. So for the value chain, this is where you see a little bit into the assumptions that are going on in the background. So we've broken down the value chain into ingredient production, consumer use, which is typically energy, used for cooking and that sort of thing, or chilling. Retail and food service operations, so that might be any transport they do or their site operations. Food manufacturing, packaging production, additional transport upstream and downstream, commuting, and waste. So the only emissions within this donut that are based on primary data are the commuting emissions and the business travel. If you remember, we put in the number of full-time employees at the bottom here. So that's the only source of emissions that can calculate off the primary data. The rest is based off a estimation on the size of the business, so per pound of revenue. And then for each of these hotspots, you'll also get 3 key actions and 3 kind of pieces of guidance of how to tackle each of those hotspots, and also kind of direction to the area of the roadmap that you can find some more granular detail and more resources. So for logistics, we've got that split of HGVs, LGVs, and company cars represented in emissions splits. And similarly for building electricity, we've got gas and oil. Third and final part of this is the input quality. So this kind of basically reflects whether you used the basic inputs or the key inputs or the more advanced inputs. So for the value chain and for logistics, we just had basic, but then for building electricity, we had that more granular data. So we have 100% input quality here. And just to kind of show you kind of how the live aspect of the model works, if we were to change some of these, for instance, if we had loads of refrigerant leakage one year, and let's just move these both to 25. If we look at the detailed summary, now refrigerants has moved to the 3rd hotspot because refrigerants now represent a greater proportion than buildings electricity do. So you can move back and forth. If you start off with the key input data and then you want to get out some more information, you can then put in advanced input at a later date, and it will kind of all update accordingly. So it should be kind of quite live in that respect. And then this final tab, which I won't spend too much time on, just provides a tabular summary of the actual tons of CO2e and the proportion of the total that they make up, and also whether the data is calculated off a user input or a revenue-based estimate. So here you can see a lot of the value chain emissions are based off revenue estimates.
Emily, there's a question. Does the calculator provide for a year-on-year comparison?
It doesn't at the moment, no. I would say if you have multiple years of data, it's probably best to download like 2 versions and do one for each, and then you can kind of draw out this table for each of them and do a year-on-year comparison that way.
Okay, thank you.
How are we doing for time? Oh, well, okay. Any other questions? Let me actually stop sharing so I can see everybody.
I just want to add a quick comment on that last point where you showed the table and you showed that for some of the scope 3 value chain categories, many of them actually, it's revenue based data. So we just urge some caution in using those as very, very accurate assessments of your scope 3 emissions for any kind of official disclosures, etc. It is the scope 3 piece particularly is where it becomes more of that hotspot tool. I think the scopes 1 and 2, obviously, it can go into a bit more detail just because we're getting that primary data input.
Okay. Have we come to the end of the session?
That's all of our content. So unless there are any other questions, I think.
Fantastic. Yes, this is the opportunity to drop any other questions into the chat. So just give you a couple of minutes to do that. But thank you ever so much, Emily and Olwen. That was really, really interesting. And I think it's going to be a really useful resource as well for people to draw back on when they actually are sat at their screens with that Excel spreadsheet in front of them.